Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Missouri State Archives, a division of the Office of Secretary of State. I'm Rachel Preston, and I have the pleasure of serving on the Friends of the Missouri State Archives Board. We'd encourage you all to become friends, too, of the archives. Membership forms and sign-up sheets for mailing lists and volunteer programs are on that back table, so be sure to stop by there on your way out tonight. We always like to give you a bit of information about next month's program. In July, we invite you to attend a special presentation related to the recent centennial anniversary of World War I. Join, Save, Buy U.S. World War I posters on the home front. Presenters that night will be Amanda Langendorfer, Associate Dean of Libraries for Special Collections and Museums at Truman State University's Pickler Memorial Library, along with Assistant Professor of History, Dr. Jason McDonald, and University Art Gallery Director, Dr. Heidi Cook. They'll examine a selection of never-before exhibited World War I posters from Truman State's E.M. Violet Museum Collection. Upon entering World War I in 1917, the United States government and its civilian agencies produced roughly 3,000 different wartime posters. This art depicted the ideals of patriotism, beauty, adventure, protection, and strongly contributed to the successful mobilization of citizens during the Great War. The program will take place here in the Interpretive Center on July 12 at 7 p.m. We hope you'll join us that night. I've really been looking forward to tonight's presentation. Dr. Joel P. Rhodes is going to talk about growing up in a land called Honalee, the 60s in the lives of American children. If you were born between 1956 and 1970, you may want to take some notes. Tonight could explain a lot. I'm Exhibit A. I'm looking out in the crowd and I'm guessing we have a few more like me, so this should be very interesting. Dr. Rhodes in his book examines the social, cultural, and political changes between John F. Kennedy's inauguration in 1961 and the end of the United States involvement in Vietnam in 1973, and how these things manifested themselves in the lives of pre-adolescent Americans. By exploring important issues and iconic images from the period, Dr. Rhodes focuses not only on the immediate impact of the 60s, but also how the era continues to influence us as adults. His writing combines a certain bittersweet nostalgia with a fascinating analysis of the lives of mid-century Americans. Joel is a professor in the history department of Southeast Missouri State University. He earned his MA and PhD in history from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. His teaching and research interests are in Cold War era American social and political history, specifically the history of children and childhood. Dr. Rhodes is the author of several books and many articles and has just completed a new book on the Vietnam War and American childhood, which will be published in 2019. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Joel P. Rhodes to the Office of the Secretary of State and the Missouri State Archives.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, and I'm excited by the fact that people, when they look at the title of the book in this audience, I think get it instinctively. When I try to explain this to students, it's lost in translation because I'm like, Honalee, Puff the Magic Dragon, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and at that point, if they don't get it, then it's too late. But this was a work that I have been gearing myself towards for a number of years, and probably the most exciting part of the research was I got an opportunity to have a phone conversation with Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary, because I needed permission to use Puff the Magic Dragon, not only in the title, but also I reference it quite a little bit in the introduction. And so after tracking him down, I visited with his agent, and he said, Peter is going to want to look at the manuscript before he gives you permission. And then I got an email from him and said, hey, let's have a phone conversation. So Peter Yarrow was a big, big hero of mine growing up. So I got to talk with him for about 30 minutes, and he very graciously granted permission. And he said, but there's only one catch. He said, I want an autographed copy of the book. I said, funny, I want an autographed copy from you of the book. And so we switched books, and he signed it, Puff's dad. That was pretty cool. Anyway, I am a Cold War historian by nature, primarily social and political, particularly of the Vietnam era, and so I've always been very fascinated by the 60s. Not only because I was a child of the 60s, my father was in Vietnam when I was a little kid. I've always been drawn to that era particularly, and we as historians, I think I've done a pretty decent job over the years of analyzing and interpreting the social and political ramifications of the 1960s. And I think we have a pretty good handle on the impact of that era on American history. But what we really haven't been able to tease out is really the nature of how the 60s impacted different groups. And history impacts us all very, very differently, depending on race and class and gender. And historians gravitated towards that early on, but we still really haven't fully appreciated age as a category of analysis, how it impacted young people. And to put this into some perspective, in 1969, 4 out of every 10 Americans was under the age of 20, and there were more people under the age of 12 in the 1960s than there had been in the United States in 1881. So this is a big cohort of people, and there's also been a lot of emphasis on the baby boom generation. But very early on, I thought, the baby boomers that were born right after World War II, their experience with the 60s was very, very different from pre-adolescent children. And when I say pre-adolescent children, generally between the ages of 10 and 12, that's when kids are really kids. And so I was curious about how this particular group was impacted by the multiple social and political and economic changes of the 1960s. And not only how they experienced that, but how they made meaning of that. And so I had to become a lot better versed in educational psychology and developmental psychology, how children made meaning based on their particular developmental age, because younger children with very little in the way of abstract thinking experience these historical phenomena very differently than a 10 to 12-year-old, and they in turn experienced the 1960s very differently than did adolescents. And what I found is that by and large, people of my cohort, born between 1956 and 1970, there's about 53 million of us. And what I found is that they, in general, felt like they had kind of come late to the party. They saw the sound and the fury of the 60s primarily in the lives of their older siblings, and by the time they got old enough to experience that, the page in history had turned, and America was quite different in the 1970s. So like I said, the 60s are an incredibly important decade to American history. I think you can make a pretty decent argument that the 60s may be the most important decade in explaining who we are today, certainly in the 20th century. But what I needed to do first of all when I began this project is to find how political and social and economic change penetrated the world of children, how changes in America became changes in the reality of pre-adolescent children. Part of that was in school, certainly education. Part of it was peer groups. Part of that was community. A large part of it was parents and media. And when I say parents, it wasn't just talking to mom and dad, but mom and dad have certain preferences. They preferenced certain television shows, certain readings. There were stories they told that impacted children. Children largely experience history oftentimes distilled through their parents' interpretation. This was particularly important in the Vietnam era because if you remember back, there were only 3 television stations, and generally people only had 1 television. And so there was a campfire nature to watching television. And aside from Saturday morning, kids were never allowed to pick the TV shows. Our job was primarily as remote controls. Prior to remote controls, we changed channels, we adjusted rabbit ears. And so in the entry point of television, which I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, television was influenced by what parents wanted to watch. And in particular, when it comes to Vietnam, parents' commentary, because as a televised war, Vietnam didn't reach children undistilled. Parents had an opinion about it. And that's a very complex dynamic that I really won't go into tonight. But parents have a big part of how children understand things and the nature of that change. But children also, through their own native practices, they make up rhymes, they play games, through their friendships, they take this distilled historical reality and they shape it in ways that make sense to them. And that was the real trick, because much like women's historians early on, there wasn't much of a paper trail to really follow. Children don't leave much of an archive, and so as historians, we generally have to try to piece this together. How historical phenomena, how events, how personalities, how spectacular changes in the country became a reality, how it permeated childhood. And what I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm not going to give you every detail of the book. I'm going to focus specifically on the presidency of John Kennedy and a related aspect of that, that's the space race, to kind of give you a little bit of flavor how the rest of the book teases out. But again, how those events and the process, how gains and losses, how hopes and dreams and fears actually became reality to children. And then what I hope to do in the book is to look at the developmental age when these historical phenomena impacted childhood and see, again, not only how kids made meaning of that, but how that affected their lives. And generally it affected it in two different ways. What's called transitions, which are just minor changes. Kids kind of trim their sails to the prevailing winds. But in extreme cases, there are trajectory changes where events in the 1960s altered the course of their lives, not only in their lifestyle, their worldview, but in many cases, occupations. And it's a pretty dangerous thing to say there is a direct causal link between what happened to a child when they were 10 years old in the 1960s and things like party affiliation or voting behavior or political ideology. There's a lot of plasticity in our development over the years. But in many, many cases, you can see that events that took place very, very early on shaped very formatively how people view the world. And again, I'll throw out a big generalization here, which is kind of dangerous to begin with at the onset. But not only did children of this generation feel somehow cheated, like I said, came to the party a little bit late, weren't full participants in the 1960s, but generally they have a certain amount of polarization baked into them. They were acculturated, they were politically socialized during a time of extreme dissent and polarization in the country. And I think that helps explain a little bit, in a small way, where we are as a nation now in the 21st century. But like I said, this was a daunting task to study children and use age as a category of analysis. And one of the things that I did early on to try to get a child's perspective is I sent a letter to the editor of the 5 largest newspapers in every state in the United States, pretty much laying out what I was trying to do. I want to hear from people who were born between 1956 and 1970 about how the 1960s impacted them. And that was a pretty big task. So I basically just said, what do you remember about the 1960s? And over the course of about a year, this was about 10 years ago that I did this, over the course of about a year, I got a little over 400 responses from people all over the country. And some people sent a couple of sentences, a couple of paragraphs. Some people sent me 30 or 40 pages worth of material. And those recollections, those self-selected recollections, those pretty much make up the bulk of my research. And it was really nice in the age of the computer because I could email people back and forth and ask them for clarification. What did you mean by this? Could you elaborate on this? And we really, I think, got beyond the superficial. And there is a certain nostalgia to the book. The campfire nature of television, that is certainly a universal recollection. But childhood in the 1960s, I mean, the seasonal rhythm of school, the specials on television, the fashion. I think a lot of times we attribute the very loud fashion with the 60s, but that's actually the 1970s. Most children's fashion in the 1960s, those were earth tones primarily, very muted. And it seems like with little girls, anything that could be plaid was plaid in the 1960s. And again, as far as music, we look at the 1960s very closely associated with the music. Children experience that very, very differently. Again, you were introduced to rock and roll largely through your older brother and your older sisters, and you developed musical taste very much in line with your parents, because just like there was only one TV and one telephone in the house, there was only one radio generally, and that was in the car, and the driver was in charge of listening to that. So you generally developed tastes early on, very much in line with your parents. Beatles, very, very attractive. There's a Christopher Robin-esque quality about the Beatles that really resonated with children. The Rolling Stones, very scary individuals, so not much resonance there. But it took me a couple of years to go through all of those recollections and to make some sense of that. But I also needed some more contemporary voices. And so I spent a lot of time at the John Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson presidential libraries. And I looked at correspondence that preadolescent children sent the presidents. It was incredibly tedious work, but it was really fun. The Kennedy Library is absolutely spectacular, looking out over the harbor there in Boston. It's very distracting to try to get any research. Johnson Library in Austin is pretty cool too. But I found thousands upon thousands of letters that preadolescent children had sent those two men. I had originally thought that the end of the book would be Watergate. That historically seems to be kind of the bookends that we use to analyze the 60s. You've got Kennedy, and then you've got Nixon, you've got the inauguration, and then the resignation. But what I found is there was some unpleasantness in the early 70s, and the Nixon Library isn't accessible to researchers very much, especially their correspondence collection. So what I did is, instead of looking at Watergate, and I'd be fascinated to see the impact of Watergate on children, I ended the book in the early 1970s, which probably thematically made more sense because parenting styles changed a lot in the early 1970s. The child-centeredness that we associate with the Cold War era, the 50s and 60s, that really changed by the 1970s. And by the end of Vietnam, childhood had changed a great deal in the United States. So that kind of makes up the end of the book. But just to kind of give you a basic outline of how the book goes, I start with the inauguration of John Kennedy. And Kennedy's presidency is really important to children. The president is fundamental, the office of the presidency is fundamental in children's political socialization. Children use the president in the early elementary school grades as kind of a shorthand to understand the government. It makes perfect sense to them. I mean, from a Disney movie, you have a king and so forth. And so they understand that the president is in charge of the country and the vice president and Congress are subordinates to that. And under normal circumstances, that's an important entry point into our political culture. But imagine being politically socialized to John Kennedy. I mean, that was incredibly dynamic and very profound for a lot of young people. And I'll just give you a couple of ideas here. Uh-oh. It was working earlier.
Is the on button on?
Oh, the on button. Yeah, that would make sense. Let's just see. I found this letter in the Kennedy Library. This is a little girl in 1961. Her parents had written the president to explain that every night before bed she had to kiss this picture of John Kennedy because this was her best friend, and he became a big part of her life. And even though, especially pre-adolescents can't vote at the time, anybody under 21 can't vote in the early 1960s, the election was something that was really exciting to students, and I was amazed. You don't really see this in the 1950s at all, but kids, especially Catholic students, took a lot of interest in the election of John Kennedy. They became very active. I'll go to this one here. This young man in Oklahoma had set up a campaign headquarters in his room. Big Kennedy man went door to door, passing out leaflets and flyers for John Kennedy. Like I said, oftentimes children saw Kennedy very much as the king of the United States, and this is a piece of artwork that's in the Kennedy Library. This is a rendition of the White House, but it looks very much like a castle in that regard. And so not only the emotional attachment to John Kennedy, and you can't separate that from the assassination, but that's a whole other chapter, literally, in the book. But the bond with Kennedy and American children, I was really struck by it because it's unique. It's very, very singular. You don't see that with other presidents, and there are hundreds, probably tens of thousands of letters that reflect that notion of don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Kids writing in, I can do things for the country. I'm just a kid, but I can eat all my vegetables. I will not fight with my little sister. I will do my homework. And children generally were very volunteer-oriented when they responded to John Kennedy. Curiously enough, there's also a chapter on Lyndon Baines Johnson. You don't see nearly as many of those types of letters at the LBJ library. Kids, I think, understood that Johnson was more paternalistic in nature, and children generally asked Lyndon Johnson for things. Not only monetary things, bicycles, dolls, and so forth. One of my favorite letters, there was a 12-year-old girl from Texas, and actually from Alabama, I think about that. And she had gone over her parents' head because the Beatles were coming to town. This is in 1964, and Mom and Dad wouldn't let her and her friends go. And she thought that was really unfair, and so she was asking for a second opinion. She wanted to know if WJ could step in and allow them to go. But as far as the emotional attachment to those two presidents, and again, I'm very interested about how children felt with Richard Nixon. But with those two presidents in particular, there was a real emotional attachment, but there's also tangible things that both those administrations were responsible for. For President Kennedy, it was physical fitness, President's Council on Physical Fitness. And if you remember, there was a song, the Chicken Fat song, that children remember, having to do calisthenics and gym class and so forth. Some kids really liked that. Some kids were pretty resentful of that. There's a great letter in the Kennedy Library about, I'd just like to thank you, President Kennedy, because now my parents won't drive me any place. They think it's appropriate for me to walk every place, to be physically fit. But also Kennedy's initiative in regard to what at the time was called mental retardation. Kennedy was the first president to have a comprehensive plan to aid handicapped, developmentally, physically handicapped Americans. And so the impact on a generation of young people is not emotive when it comes to Kennedy. It's very tangible in regard to those programs. And that's certainly the case with Lyndon Johnson. The Great Society had a number of programs that were specifically geared to pre-adolescents, not only Medicaid, but also the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and of course Head Start and public television. And in a very direct way, Head Start was so successful, free preschool for disadvantaged children was so successful in its early years in 65 and 66, that public television decided to make a TV show out of it, which is Sesame Street. So again, I think it's appropriate to say, I think it's correct to say that Sesame Street was actually brought to you by the letters L, B, and J in that regard. So those two presidencies make up a big chunk of the book. I also take a look at the Vietnam War, which a chapter doesn't really do it justice, so I've expanded that out. And now in this new book, I look specifically at how Vietnam impacted childhood here in the United States and also in Vietnam as well. I looked at the civil rights movement. Interestingly enough, I found that children in the South, the civil rights movement was the biggest event in the 1960s. Children in the North Vietnam was the biggest event, primarily because pre-adolescent children were the first integrated Americans. Most school integration began in the elementary school grades, and so they were on the front lines really of school integration. I also look at the counterculture, hippies, and how hippies raise children. That was a trip, no pun intended, to look at that. And then I also look at the women's liberation movement, how it impacted children. And what was really interesting about this part of the book is that virtually every child that I talked to, 400 some people, nobody ever remembered any bra burning or women's liberation, primarily because that didn't really happen. That's a myth. But nobody ever remembered mom marching in the streets or being liberated. But what they failed to recognize is that because of Vietnam, because of the skyrocketing divorce rate in the United States, they were raised by increasingly strong, independent women. Probably the greatest impact of the 1960s on pre-adolescent children was strong female role models. And this seismic shift in childhood went virtually unnoticed by kids at the time. But like I said, what I'd like to do today, and I burn up 25 minutes with the introduction here, I want to focus specifically on Kennedy, and in particular, one really romantic, important element of the Kennedy presidency, and that is the space race. And the space race, I gotta say at the onset, by way of caveat, is inseparable from nuclear weapons. There is a real parallel to them. They are interlocked. The idea of rockets and missiles were very familiar to Cold War era children. And I should probably also point out that because preschool children really don't have abstract thinking skills, the words Cold War were literal. They understood the country to be in an actual war with the Soviet Union, with communism. Older pre-adolescents understood the abstractions. They understood that the country was technically at peace, but we competed with the Soviet Union. And the anti-communism that really colors America in the post-war years, kids were real believers in that. And the space race in particular, children are terrified by nuclear weapons, and again, that's a whole other story. There was a great article this year that came out in the Missouri Historical Review about the baby teeth campaign, especially in St. Louis, how a group of mothers launched a campaign to have strontium-90 tested in baby teeth, and children all over the country remember. And this was very painful because instead of getting your dime from the tooth fairy, you were asked to donate your baby teeth to science. And that's a hardship when you're 7 or 8 years old. But again, nuclear weapons, there was always this lingering fear. But the space race was like a silver lining to that. It was a way to compete with the Soviet Union, that competition, but in a much safer way to do that. And when Kennedy first announced the space program, in particular announced his desire to go to the moon, it's like an entire decade-long rocket ride with Kennedy. And it was almost a made-for-television event because it's like an 8-year miniseries narrated by Walter Cronkite. At least initially they used models because they didn't have very good television footage, but the footage got better with each passing year, and the narration got better as well. And the Mercury 7 astronauts, when they were first introduced in 1959, these became larger than life figures. And one of the things that I found in my research is that when I asked young people, what did you want to be when you grew up? 2 occupations by far and away dominated both males and females. One of them was astronauts, and a very, very far second was rock and roll musician. So the astronauts were huge to this story. The space race, as you know, kind of the United States stumbles out of the gate. Alan Shepard goes up in May of 1961, and Gus Grissom goes up in the summer of 1961. Finally, in February 1962, John Glenn becomes the first American to orbit the planet. And for American children, like I said, this was a captivating time. And there was a great deal of transitional change in children's lives. They become glued to this, they become obsessed with this, and it begins to permeate their reality in a number of different ways. And I'll give you some ideas here with some quotes that I collected. This is a person from Minnesota, born in 1956. He said, "That captivated little kids' minds like nothing I've ever seen in my lifetime. We all went to school with our little NASA lunchbox and this and that and the other things. And we had these little toy rockets, and it was always John Glenn this and Alan Shepard that. Another student or another young person from, I think from Michigan. We used to be able to name all 7 of the original astronauts. They were like superhuman beings to us. They were the best and the brightest and the most daring and adventurers. They were the pioneers. They were the Lewis and Clark of our generation, heading out into space. It just captivated my imagination, and you'd sit there and watch it on television, the rocket blasting off and the splashdown. I idolized the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. If there were ever heroes in my life, these were the ones. Another man born in 1958 in Alabama said the excitement of the space race and the president calling for us to go to the moon, right then I determined my career choice. I was going to be a scientist. Ultimately, I wanted to be an astronaut. That was the first time that I realized that he was born in 1958, so he's in preschool. That was the first time that I decided or thought about what I wanted to be when I grew up. Missouri man, born in 1956, contacted me. He said the space program, it just went off with young people. For older people, I think it astonished older people. It's like, wow, I can't believe they did that. But with us kids, we would just sit around at night or in the afternoon and talk about it. And it was like, it just captivated us. We would ask ourselves, what do you think it's like in space? Do you think John Glenn gets scared? Or do they go to the bathroom? Things like that. How do you imagine that they sleep? And for most people, like I said, for most young people, television was the entry point. Not only on the TV news, and a big thing for children in particular is when the real world permeates the classroom, and they remember 2 times TVs, actually 3, TVs being brought into the classroom. The first was Kennedy's inauguration, but they also remember for the Mercury and Gemini flights, teachers bringing TVs into their classroom and incorporating that into their science curriculum. The first of the TV-themed shows, and again, 1950s television is dominated by Westerns. Most primetime shows are Westerns. So it took television a little bit to incorporate space. There was some reluctance early on by the networks to broadcast the launches live because so many early launches failed. So it wasn't until the mid-1960s that live footage of the launches were actually televised. Splashdowns weren't televised until the late 60s because they weren't always real sure where it was going to happen and they couldn't get television crews out there. But for space to begin to crack primetime television, it took Disney to do that. And in 1959, the Disneyland series, which used to air on Sunday nights, had a 3-part series, Man in Space, Man in the Moon, and Mars and Beyond. And it was narrated from Tomorrowland in Disneyland. And eventually when Disney took their older movies and reintroduced those, reran those in theaters in the 1960s, those were usually the first feature, those space-themed programs. The first real popular space-themed program for children was the Jetsons, which came out in 1962. And in and of itself, it's not that important because the Jetsons are essentially just the Flintstones in outer space. The Flintstones were really just the honeymooners in prehistoric times. So it wasn't that innovative, but it was the very first time that space took up a very central place in primetime television. There were periodic episodes of The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits that dealt with space, but The Jetsons was the very first that did that. And later, Lost in Space came out a couple of years later, coinciding kind of with the Gemini program. And it was a live action space program that, again, just reinforced what children are learning about the Mercury 7 astronauts. And it didn't take long, of course, before advertising cashed in on this as well. There was a number of products that were introduced, I should say, space to their advertising in the 1960s. Kids' sneakers used space as an advertising ploy. Used to be able to get a special coin in golden flake potato chips. There was a really curious combination. I still haven't figured this one out. But V8 and Cheerios partnered together with a promotion to combine those 2 breakfast foods. And I don't highly recommend it. It sounds terrible, and indeed it is. But They hid a free moon rocket inside boxes of Cheerios, and they also had space games that were played, and for so many box tops from Cheerios and from V8, you could receive a certain prize. Post actually had its own space cereal count-off, which the little flakes, the little cereals were in numeric form, and so you could have a count-off, a blast-off count-off in your bowl, if that's what you wanted to do. But everybody remembers one particular product from General Mills being most associated with space and astronauts, and that is Tang. And Tang was first introduced in the Gemini program in the mid-1960s. But probably the one program that most people from this cohort remember is Star Trek. Now, Star Trek didn't come out until 1966, so it's well into the Gemini program. The Mercury program was designed to try to get a human in space. The Gemini program was designed to keep them alive in space, all with an eye towards getting to the moon. So there's a sequence to NASA's program. But Star Trek, when it ran originally between 1966 and 1969, by that time it's more associated with the moon landings itself. But Gene Roddenberry first pitched the idea in 1964, and the idea behind Star Trek is that it is cooperative, that the entire planet is cooperating in space travel, and that's very reflective of John Kennedy's original ideas about the space program, that it wasn't just the United States going to the moon, that other countries would contribute. They would contribute communications, computer technology, and so forth. I think by 1968, 1969, when they introduced the character of Chekhov, a Russian member of the Enterprise, most of the residual competition of the space race had worn off. But I think had Chekhov been introduced earlier in the 1960s, kids would have had a really hard time with that. Because like I said, competition was a big part of the space race. Kids cheered much the way they would in a sporting event. And there's a number of letters at the Kennedy Library that backs this up. This is a young lady from Connecticut, I believe, and she says, she's writing to John Kennedy, "I do not want to see a sickle and hammer on the moon." Oh, she's from New Mexico, pardon me about that. "What if the Russians get there first? Will they say they own it? Do you think they would share the moon with us?" There's a 12-year-old girl from Connecticut to John Kennedy. "I would like to ask you a question, Mr. Kennedy, so would you please answer me in a way that a sixth grader can understand? Why do we publicize news about almost every rocket and how it runs? The Russian leaders may be reading our magazines, they may be watching our television, and they're getting ideas about our rockets. All they're going to do is copy our rockets, call it something different, and get to the moon before us. I don't like the idea of red hands on the moon. Who does?" Kids were so invested in this that there are a number, and I saw hundreds of donations, kids sending in their allowance, $1, $2 to the Moon Fund to help fund NASA. And there were a number of people that when they wrote in about this said, if this doesn't help with the moon program, perhaps a big statue of John Glenn in Washington, D.C. You could use the money for that. There are hundreds of prototype drawings in the Kennedy Library that kids sent in. Kids were really imaginative, and they wanted to help. I mean, it wasn't just whimsical. It's very cute to look back on, but kids were really serious, and they thought, this is going to be my contribution. I can design a rocket that will perhaps do better than what NASA's rockets do. Here's an 11-year-old boy from West Virginia, and he's got a lot of chutzpah here, but he says, this is to John Kennedy, "Now let's get down to business. I think I know how to get to the moon or Pluto, the last planet in the solar system, or even maybe a little further, space platforms. What I'm talking about is fuel, like a gas station in space. This equals success, parenthetically, probable success. P.S. I am sending you my autograph and a model of how I think this space station will work. This is serious. Do not print this in newspapers or anything. Some anti-American types are looking for these ideas." There was one letter that really struck me. And again, this is what I mean by transitional changes. So I use this by way of an example. This is the mother of an 11-year-old boy from Dearborn, Michigan. And she wrote to John Kennedy. She was very sincerely thankful because her son was a poor student and was not doing very well in elementary school. But she said, since the space race, he had really become interested in science. And he had become much more academically inclined. And she said when she got off work, one night she came home and found him asleep at the dining room table, but he had written her a note before he fell asleep. And she shared this note with John Kennedy. The note said, Mommy, tonight I outlined a whole, spelled incorrectly, chapter in my science book, finished a report for our team in geography, spelled incorrectly, got my geography notebook, both spelled incorrectly, in order for tomorrow. I am not going to let Russia get ahead of me. Pretty cool. As far as space play, and again, this is another way that that historical realities become real in the lives of children. Space play was very, very important to children. Again, kind of a little bit of background, and I think this is what makes toys from our generation, from the Cold War generation, a lot more, a lot more nostalgic because there just weren't as many of them. Kids' toy boxes today are huge compared to kids' toy boxes, certainly in the 50s and 60s and in previous generations. For one thing, toys were a special event type of proposition. There are only a couple of gift-giving holidays. The idea of mom and dad buying you a toy outside of Christmas or your birthday, or maybe a couple other minor ones, that was fairly unheard of, and you only had your local toy store to go to. And so I think that's what makes a lot of those toys, Barbie, G.I. Joe, very iconic to our generation. But you see a huge proliferation of science and technology toys in the mid-1960s. Chemistry sets, ham radios, amateur radios, transistor radios, model planes, and so forth. That really starts to dominate mostly boyhood culture, but certainly for little girls as well. In the new book on Vietnam, I look at war toys in the 1960s, and so it's part of the same package. But models, plastic models by Monogram, by Revell, by Kenner, take on pronounced space themes in the 1960s. Many of you probably remember Louis Marx, the toy company. They were famous for very elaborate, garishly colored play sets, and the Cape Canaveral set, there it is, came out in 1965. And what else you got? You got all sorts of different stuff. The Ben Cooper Halloween costume company started to introduce astronaut costumes, the kind that had the plastic mask that you could neither see nor breathe out of, and then the vinyl tunic that went with it, but again, chemistry sets and so forth. Anything rocket-based, both in metals and in plastic. This is Major Matt Mason, the first very popular astronaut toy in the United States. Came out in the mid-1960s, didn't really take off until we got closer to the moon in 1969, and that became a huge toy. But goggles and helmets and boots and so forth. Picture here at the beginning, on Christmas morning here, these are space boots, these are moon boots, and there's a helmet that goes with that. And then of course the cardboard fireplace, which you don't see very much of anymore. One person from California wrote about these particular space toys, especially the Jetsons toys that were licensed from the TV show. He said younger kids just ate these shows up. The older folks hated them. My mom was always saying, why don't you turn that stuff off? Turn my shows on. That's science fiction. I'm like, no, it's not. This is real life. We're going to space. This is real stuff. This is important. I'm going to be a spaceman, so I've got to play space today. And we would build little aircraft and little models, and we would have our missions. It was just very, very imaginative, they said. And one person contacted me and said that he and his friends in the neighborhood had pilfered Dad's lumber and plumbing in the garage, and they had built a capsule that 3 of them intended to live in for 2 weeks one summer. until their mom caught wind of what they were doing and said we weren't allowed to spend the night in the capsule, but we were really interested to see exactly how that would work. Now, some of you probably remember that Kennedy had announced that we were going to the moon earlier in a joint session of Congress, but it became public in a speech he gave in the summer of 1962 at Rice University. And I can't do Kennedy's accent usually, so I'm not even going to try. But this idea about we're not going to the moon because it's easy, we're going to go to the moon because it's hard. And I talked to a number of shuttle-era astronauts, and they said that for them, that was the transitional change. So the trajectory change. We talk about transitional changes, and they're actually very minor changes in how children play or the things that they're interested in. But many shuttle-era astronauts remember that it was the Mercury and Gemini program, and in particular Kennedy's Rice University speech in July of 1962. That was the trajectory change to them. If you remember that speech, Kennedy says, we're going to land a man on the moon and bring them home by the end of the decade. That wasn't by coincidence. John Kennedy left that date deliberately ambiguous because the intention was in the Kennedy administration that would be the crowning achievement of the second term. That Kennedy's last year in office, we would land on the moon, and that would be the capstone of his presidency. And one shuttle-era astronaut, Linda Godwin, who teaches at the University of Missouri, said that at that moment, it was a foregone conclusion that we would reach the moon, that NASA, once Kennedy was assassinated, NASA was not going to be the one that didn't fulfill that. So the assassination was very impactful in that regard. But I interviewed Linda Godwin. Again, she's a shuttle-era astronaut, and she traced her decision to be an astronaut specifically to the Mercury and Gemini programs, and in particular, Kennedy's speech, and more particular book, Robert Heinlein's Half Spacesuit Will Travel, which her sixth grade science teacher suggested to her, and she said it was one of those really transformational books in her life. But I want to end, and then I'll open this up to questions a little bit, with a couple of oral histories from astronauts speaking specifically about this trajectory change and how the 60s impacted them in the course of their lives. This is Brian Duffy, who was an astronaut from Boston. He said, so I was interested in aviation and kind of amazed by it along the way. Then the space program started, and I was in the third grade, so this is 1961, when Shepard was launched. And I remember watching that on television, and it took my interest in aviation and my amazement to this whole new level. And I'm thinking like, wow, we can actually leave the planet. That must be about the coolest thing a person could do. So by the time I was in elementary school, all I wanted to be was an astronaut. This is William Redding, another shuttle-era astronaut, said, when I was in elementary school, there was no such thing as an astronaut. Then starting out with Glenn's flight, I was about 9 in the early 60s. All of a sudden, we're in the space age. Not just Sputnik orbiting, not just this piece of metal, but people. And that changed my life. But my favorite is David Wolf, who was born in Indianapolis in 1956. He said, before I wanted to be an astronaut, up until that moment, the Mercury program, I wanted to be a garbage man. Because Mr. Peacock, our garbage man, let me run the garbage truck. It was an old-time thing with big levers, and he let me help. I told my parents that I wanted to be a garbage man, and they said, okay, if you want to be a garbage man, just be the best one. So then at dinner one night, I announced my big decision. I'm going to be a garbage man, I'm going to be an astronaut. To which my mom said, not many people get to do that, so don't be too disappointed if you can't. So, there you go. And I'll open that up to questions.